Merci à tous de bien vouloir regagner vos places. Merci de votre discipline. Il est 11h01, vous êtes formidables. Alors, il y a un instant, on a évidemment, vous étiez là, j'imagine, nous avons longuement parlé d'Irma, Saint-Martin, Saint-Barthélemy. Tout à l'heure, nous parlerons des crues de la Seine. Tout de suite, on va s'ouvrir, si j'ose dire. On va parler des incendies en Californie. Petit rappel, vous commencez à bien maîtriser maintenant, plus que bien maîtriser maintenant, notre nouvel outil Klaxon qui vous permet de participer en direct à l'ensemble de nos débats. Je vous rappelle la procédure, en tout cas pour ceux qui viennent d'arriver. Vous pouvez poser toutes les questions que vous souhaitez à nos invités. Vous pourrez également répondre à des questions de plusieurs sondages que nous allons faire tout au long de cette journée. C'est affiché www.application.klaxon.com. C'est très facile, très simple. Et vous pourrez, si vous le souhaitez, également poser des questions d'une façon plus traditionnelle avec des micros si vous le souhaitez. Donc je le disais, autre témoignage ce matin, retour d'expérience également. J'ai le plaisir d'accueillir Mr. Glenn McGillivray. Vous pouvez monter sur scène, merci infiniment. Vous êtes le directeur général de l'Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Vous allez vous exprimer en anglais, mais il n'y a aucun souci. Il y a une traduction pour ceux qui ne maîtrisent pas votre langue en anglais. Petite question, encore une fois, de logistique. On me demande juste bien à l'heure du déjeuner de ramener les casques, dont d'ailleurs vous pourrez vous resservir cet après-midi. McGillivray, donc merci encore d'être là. Je vous laisse la parole. Glenn, it's your time.
Merci. Thank you for having me. I am Canadian. I do not speak French. I should have paid more attention in school, I believe. I apologize for that. I've been asked to speak to you today about wildfire in California, and I will do that. I will also talk about two other major wildfires that we experienced over the last few years, one in Tennessee and one in Canada. And the four of them together will help me weave a nice story behind the myths and misconceptions that we have about wildfire risk. I don't want to waste a lot of time telling you about ICLR. You can go to our website, but we've been around for 20 years, and we work with the Canadian insurance industry, the non-life industry, to reduce the impact of natural disasters on people and property in Canada. These are the themes I wanted to go over. As mentioned, I do want to talk about two major wildfire losses in California last year, but I also want to talk about a major loss that happened in Tennessee in 2016, and a major loss that happened in Canada also in 2016. And I want to cut through the myths and misconceptions about wildfire, and there are a lot of them. And I want to also close with a few comments about wildfire and the business of insurance and reinsurance. The four fires I want to talk to you about are primarily the Southern California wildfires of last December, in particular the Thomas Fire. That fire burned for 6 months, and it was only extinguished this past Saturday. As a matter of fact. I want to talk about the Northern California wildfires from October of last year, in particular the Tubbs Fire. I want to speak to you about the Great Smoky Mountains wildfires in November 2016, and in particular the Chimney Tops Fire. And I want to speak to you about the Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada fire, also in 2016. This was the fire situation in California last year. It was a very active year in California, though California is very famous for its wildfires. This is not meant to be understood. It's just meant to overwhelm you and give you, the awe of wildfire risk in California. It's absolutely tremendous. But last year was a particularly bad year, and we had big fires going straight on through to November and December, which is very rare in California. There's the Northern California fire right there, the Southern California fire, both circled right there, but many, many other losses last year. These were particularly bad ones, though. This is the fire risk map for California in December of last year, and you notice that red spot in California. Over the next couple of minutes, you'll understand how important these fire risk maps are. They're not indicative of where fire is going to happen, definitely, but will give you a good idea of where the risk is. And these next few maps I'm going to show you today turned out to be quite accurate because some of the really large fires happened exactly where the risk was indicated. So the Southern California wildfires of last December, there was a complex of 29 fires. And when we talk about a complex, we talk about multiple fires, okay? So there were 29 fires last year. 6 became really, really large. So usually over 300 acres or 200 hectares is how we define a large fire. Those 6 fires alone burned over 124,000 hectares. 230,000 people were evacuated. The Thomas Fire in particular was a very bad one. It was around the Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. It became the largest wildfire in modern California history. It started on December 4th. It was contained on January 12th, and it was only put out, as I mentioned, this past Saturday. Over 1,000 structures were lost, 280 were damaged, 2 people were killed. The insured losses from the 3 worst fires of the 29 were about 1.81 billion euro, about 2.1 billion insured. That's just from 3 of the 29 fires. I don't want to show you a lot of pictures today because after a while they all start looking the same. But on the left there is before the fire, and on the right is, of course, during the fire, the exact same vantage point. And here we have before and after pictures. Sometimes it's very difficult to determine the loss. If you get up close to the pictures, you'll see nice little piles of ash where houses used to stand. This was the situation in Northern California in October of last year. And again, a much greater risk area, a much greater area of red in California, but that came after a fairly long and dry summer. So a large area to be sure, but again, very indicative of where the risk is. And this turned out to be, again, very accurate. With the fires in Northern California in October, there were over 250 fires. So there was about 29 in December, but 250 in October. Over 100,000 hectares were burned. Unlike the previous fires, though, 8,900 structures were lost in total, including many Napa Valley wineries, which drove the insured loss values up very high. The Tubbs Fire was the biggest of them all. It affected Sonoma and Napa counties and burned 5,600 acres just by itself. Just that one fire, the Tubbs Fire, caused about 6.6 billion euro insured, or 7.7 billion US dollars insured. From one fire, that's an all-time record by an absolutely huge margin. It's the most destructive wildfire in world insurance history, more than double the fire, the 1993 fire outside of San Francisco. When you combine the southern and the northern fires in California last year, we're looking at over 12 billion euro insured. Again, an all-time record. About 14 billion US insured. Again, a few pictures, but they all start looking the same after a while, so I don't want to show you too many pictures, but it just gives you a flavor of what happened in Northern California in October of last year. This was the Tennessee fire, and I'm showing you this fire in particular for a very particular reason. Look at the risk there in the southeastern U.S. in November of 2016. And again, this turned out to be very indicative of where the large fire is most apt to happen. And indeed, there's Tennessee right in there. One of the reasons I'm showing you this fire is because it happened in the east. We all are under the impression that large wildfires happen in western U.S. Once in a while, we get a big one in the east, and this one was 1 billion insured U.S. So this was a very substantial fire. Very, very rare for the east and very, very rare for November. And that's the main reasons I'm showing you this fire. Again, there was a complex of fires in that area in November, so there was more than one fire. Several broke out over the November-December period. And one of the big drivers of the fire and the spread of fire were the high winds that were in occurrence at that time. High winds and fire don't go well together. First of all, if you get a small fire, the high winds will make it a large fire. It will also drive embers far ahead of the fire front and start spot fires way ahead of the fire. Secondly, it downs power lines, and power lines themselves cause fires as well. There were over 14 people killed, 134 injured. The biggest fire of this complex was the Chimney Tops fire. Unfortunately, this fire was caused by 2 teenagers. It was a criminal arson fire. So 2 teenagers are responsible for killing over a dozen people from this fire. So in particular, the Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg, Tennessee areas were hit really hard by this fire. There were over 2,400 buildings lost, and the insured damage was pretty close to $1 billion US dollars, or 788 million euro. Very substantial fire for that part of the U.S. at that time of year. And here are some of the pictures. Very somewhat rural area, but a lot of high-cost vacation properties and retirement properties in that area. And fire did get into town as well in the Gatlinburg. And this is the Fort McMurray situation in May of 2016. The red and the orange indicates the highest risk, and Fort McMurray is located right there. So again, these maps are very, very important. They're not going to guarantee you where you're going to get fire, but they're pretty indicative of where the risk is, and the last 4 maps I showed you were quite accurate. Very important. These are daily maps. So you can check, this is a daily map in Canada. You can check out the risk every day. The Fort McMurray fire is officially known as the Horse River Fire. It started on May 3rd of 2016. It was human caused, but it was accidental, and some people think it was an all-terrain vehicle that started it. About 2,400 structures were lost. That was about 7 to 8% of that town, of the town of Fort McMurray. Almost 50,000 claims were filed, and insured damage was about 2.4 billion euro. So for a very, very short period of time, that was the largest wildfire loss in world insurance history until the California fires came along and bumped it down to about 3rd place, I think. It was one of the very first disasters in Canada that we got to watch unfold before our eyes through technology. We got to watch this town, 8% of the town lost as it was actually happening. And our researcher took this picture. It takes about 500 degrees Celsius for this to happen, and that fire was burning at about 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. So, lesson number 1 about wildfires. Number 1 is wildfires don't always happen when you think they usually happen. So, of course, we all think that wildfires happen in the height of summer or late summer, early fall when you've had a long, dry summer. That's true, but it's not the only time we get wildfire. And if you look at California last year, 2 record wildfires at the very tail end of the year. Quite common in November, quite uncommon in December. There have only been, over the last 15 years, there's only been 3 large fires in California in December, and one of them was last year. So very, very rare. So don't always bet that wildfires only happen in the summer and only happen after prolonged heat. It's not always true. And again, that $1 billion wildfire in Tennessee is very indicative. It was greatly unexpected in that part of the country at that time of year. Virtually all large destructive U.S. wildfires have been in the West. And so we have been trained, our brain has been trained to understand that only large fires happen in the Western U.S., and that is not true. In boreal forest countries like Canada, and 60% of Canada is boreal forest, we actually have 2 distinct wildfire seasons, and this is unknown. A lot of people don't realize this. We do have a very high wildfire season at the height of summer and the tail end of summer after a long, hot summer. That's very common, of course. The other wildfire season we have is usually early May. That is after the snow, but before the forest greens up. And the last 2 record wildfires we've had in California happened in May. The Slave Lake wildfire happened on May 14th of 2011, and the Fort McMurray wildfire happened on May 3rd, 2016. A lot of people in Canada say, well, that's early for a wildfire. It's not true. That's a peak period for wildfire. Indeed, 1 week before the Slave Lake wildfire, there was still snow on the ground. So you do not need a prolonged period of dry and heat. All you need is a few dry days and a few low humidity days. Ignition, fuel, and wind, and you're off. And the U.S. is said to be moving toward a 12-month wildfire season, largely due to climate change and other factors. Lesson number 2, wildfires don't always happen how you probably think they happen. Now, there's a myth about wildfire. I think most people think that wildfire rolls through the forest like an out-of-control steamroller, and then it meets up with the edge of town, and then it keeps on steamrolling in through town, and that's not what happens. What happens in a wildfire, generally speaking, is that burning embers get caught up in the convective storm, in the convection. So burning material gets pulled up into the atmosphere. It gets blown ahead of the wildfire front, sometimes many, many kilometers ahead of the wildfire front. The embers will then fall, and if they fall in a city in unflammable material, they will start a fire. Once the structure is on fire, it will ignite neighboring structures, and then you have an urban conflagration. Now, it is very true that during a wildfire, you can have a building lost due to direct impingement from flame. You can have a building lost due to flammable gases, but generally speaking, it's the embers. So if we can make a city resilient against the embers, we can prevent it from burning down in a wildfire. So this is a huge myth in wildfires. We did a study in Fort McMurray. We got a researcher in before the citizens were allowed back into the city. And what I had him look at, I asked him to answer the question, why did some homes survive in neighborhoods that were completely destroyed? I started to see pictures from the media of completely destroyed neighborhoods except for 2 houses here, 5 houses there, 3 houses there. Why? And our researcher did a very extensive investigation, and he determined that it's the wind-driven embers that caused the fire in town, and those structures that did not burn were resilient against wind-driven embers. They did not have fuel right near the home. And this is very key. How you landscape your property, where you store your firewood, where you put your propane tank, having a wood fence attached to the house, having a wood shed next to the house. All these things are fuel. The embers will ignite those things, then ignite the home. And the fewer of those things that you have around the house, the better the chance of it surviving. You will find that report on our website at ICLR.org. Thirdly, wildfires don't always happen where you think they will happen. Again, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a great surprise to the insurance industry and to Gatlinburg. About $1 billion in November in the east. Very, very rare occurrence. But then if you look at the Tubbs fire in California, the majority of the homes that were lost in Santa Rosa, California, were in the moderate risk area of the city. So in California, every community has to have a fire danger map. And I'll show you that map in a moment. The fire danger for Santa Rosa was very low. It was not immediately near the forest, and yet thousands of structures were lost deep in the urban center of Santa Rosa. These are the fire risk maps for the county, Sonoma County, that Santa Rosa is located. The majority of the homes lost were right in there, way away from the red, away from the yellow, away from the orange. This was in the low to moderate risk area of the city. Why did those homes burn? They burnt because of ember travel. These fire danger maps did not take the high California winds into consideration, and that ember travel was extensive. Once the embers got into that part of the town, they started igniting structures, which then ignited other structures, and you had dangerous spread of fire. So these maps, it's imperative that they redo these maps and include the Santa Ana winds into consideration. What is the situation with wildfire and climate change? The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says, quote, fire frequency is expected to increase with human-induced climate change, especially where precipitation remains the same or is reduced. Wildfire and climate change means that we'll have earlier starts to the fire season. We'll have significant increases in the area experiencing high to extreme fire danger. Some areas, like anything else, will get less fire or the same fire, but other places will get more fire. With the U.S. National Climate Assessment, they say, quote, increasing temperatures will contribute to increased fire frequency, intensity, and size. In Canada, we have had a doubling in area burned since the 1970s, and we expect, through the models, a further doubling of area burned through the next century. So this is real. It's already happened. It's here upon us now. Just want to say something very briefly about modeling wildfire risk for those insurers and reinsurers out in the audience here. There are many challenges with modeling wildfire risk. And so, first of all, you have to build a stochastic catalog of likely wildfire events. You have to capture both the frequency and severity of likely events. You have to integrate the effects of extreme fire weather conditions into those events. You have to obtain historical loss data for calibration, and you have to extrapolate historical fire incidents to produce expected outcomes. Okay, not my area, so if you're into modeling, you'll understand that completely. If you're not, you can ignore what I just said. These are how you implement what I just told you. And a lot of what is here talks about getting hazard information. That, to me, is not really a challenge. In places like the United States, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, getting information on wildfire hazard, the physical nature of wildfire, is quite easy, I think. There is great information out there. Government does excellent work on wildfire hazard. The hard part is in the red here, establishing a database of historical claims information. That is the tough part. It's very difficult in Canada to get a catalog of losses. None of the big insurers will share their data, of course. There is a product in Canada where we try to consolidate all the claims information, but it's not a very good database because every company codes their claims differently. This is a really, really big challenge. There are other challenges related to modeling wildfire, but I will leave that for another day. Tornadoes and wildfire, what do the two things have in common? Two very, very different risks, hazards altogether. What is the similarity between tornado and wildfire, if you are an insurer or a reinsurer? It's all about accumulation management, being careful about how much business you write and where you write it. There are a lot of companies that got themselves into trouble because they are over-concentrated in certain areas. And indeed, we have a company in Fort McMurray, Alberta that was on the edge of getting into a problem because it was over-concentrated in that city and did not have a very robust reinsurance program. So it is very, very key that you manage your accumulations properly and ensure that you're not over-concentrated in particular high-risk areas. Quickly about the wildfire and proximate cause rule. So a little bit after the California wildfires in January of this year, there were massive mudslides in Montecito, California. 21 people were killed, 100 homes were destroyed, 300 were damaged. Insured damage was about $171 million US. There is a known connection between wildfire and flood or wildfire and mudslide for three reasons. First of all, a fire causes loss of vegetation, it causes slope destabilization, and it bakes the earth very hard so that the rain doesn't soak into the earth and just washes off of it. So there have been two court cases in the US that states that if the flood or the mudslide was caused by the wildfire, it is covered under the standard property policy. Normally in the US, you need a national flood insurance policy for flood, but these courts have ruled that if the flood is caused by the wildfire, it is covered under the standard policy. So a word of warning, don't think that you're just covering wildfire loss. You may also be covering flood loss and mudslide loss a month after the event or something like that. Wildfire and liability. Very quickly, anybody can be pulled into a liability case due to causing a wildfire. Many governments have been sued because they've allowed controlled fires to escape. Many governments have been sued because they failed to suppress a fire. Public utilities, electrical utilities have been sued for causing wildfires. Railroads are very big, being sued for causing wildfires as well. And individuals can be sued due to criminal arson, abandoned campfires, carelessly discarded cigarettes, use of chainsaws, and that sort of thing. So anybody can be pulled into a casualty or liability suit. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Merci beaucoup, Green McGillivray. Thank you for all.
Thank you.
3 lessons we have understand, but it was a big surprise for you. The time, the period, the record of damage, and the most expensive.
Right, exactly.
OK. Maintenant, si vous avez des questions, klaxon, ça fonctionne encore. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français et même en anglais. Notre invité, évidemment, va y répondre dans un instant. Est-ce que... Voilà. Alors, question en anglais. Vous les voyez, Monsieur McGillivray, vous pouvez les lire ici. What kind of solution do we have to prevent fires? First question.
First of all, we have to understand that in many places in the world, like northern latitude countries that have boreal forests, fire is necessary for the survival of the forest. It is not a bad thing when a forest burns. It's a horrible thing when a city burns. And we have to understand that we sometimes need fire. We need it for regeneration. We need it for the forest to grow. But we don't need it to burn down communities. So we have to learn how to live with fire. We have to understand that, that fire is sometimes a necessary thing and smoke is sometimes a necessary thing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to learn to build communities that are resilient to the embers that I spoke to you about. That is the main driver of loss, And if we can build communities that are less flammable, particularly when they're in the interface between a community and the forest, when they're right next to the forest, we will be much better off if we're able to make our communities less flammable against ember travel.
Okay, another one. Do you use satellite images for assessing weekends the fire potentials? You can read the question here.
Which one was that?
The second one.
Second one?
Yeah.
Do we use satellite images?
Yes.
Absolutely. As I showed you with the Fort McMurray fire, that was one of the very first times we used satellite as the event was unfolding. Another thing that the local government did in Fort McMurray is they used satellite pictures to show every individual property before and after the fire so that homeowners could go to them and see if their house had been saved or not. It was all done through satellite imagery. Satellite imagery is becoming very, very important. And it was the satellite over the equator that actually detected the first ignition of the fire. So satellites are very key in this type of work, absolutely.
Yeah. Another one, natural impact but human cause. It's more easy to control for the next year or the another year?
The only way it's easier to control human-caused fires, we can educate people about the danger and the stupid things that they do, like discarding cigarettes or abandoning a campfire. Once a fire is started, though, it doesn't matter how it began, whether it's lightning or human-caused. A fire is a fire. So we can prevent certain fires from happening, but once it starts, it doesn't matter really how it started. It's exactly the same animal.
Okay, another question, peut-être des questions par le micro. Maybe how convenient is it to provide arsonists with the fire risk maps? Do you read the question?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, is it not a good thing?
Yeah.
I don't think you have to be too smart to figure out where to start a fire. I don't think you need a map to determine where to start one. I think the benefits of having these maps far outweigh the risk. So I think it's very key to have these maps available. And I don't think it really matters to arsonists if they're even stupid arsonists would know where to start a dangerous fire, I think. So.
Yeah. Another one, could you comment the role of the fighters in wildfire protection?
Absolutely. I mean, firefighting is absolutely key, and we have good resources in Canada and the United States and elsewhere in the world. We also trade resources. In Canada, provinces will help each other. The U.S. will help Canada. Canada will help the U.S. We help Australia. We go elsewhere. Firefighters is absolutely key, but it's important to understand that, number one, a fire of 200 hectares or higher is almost impossible to put out, especially a crown fire, a really intense fire, a large fire, virtually impossible to suppress. More water bombers, more trucks, more hoses, more pumps won't help the situation. We have to make our communities less flammable, and there's only so much we can do with water bombers and hoses and pumps and men.
Une autre question qui revient beaucoup, 11 questions qui fait un peu la comparaison entre ce qui peut se passer aux États-Unis, au Canada et en France. Do you know what we do not have that important wildfire in France? Any structural reason?
I'm not really familiar with the situation in France, but I was speaking to somebody just before the event here, and Sweden just had one of its first wildfires apparently. So it really depends on the makeup of the forests in this country. I mean, in Canada we have the boreal forest is a conifer forest. It's a pine needled forest. It's like gasoline. When that forest is dry, it's like fuel. I'm not really familiar with the forest makeup in France. It may just be luck. It might be education. It may be many things, but unfortunately, I'm really not familiar with the situation in France.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.